I got it. What? My friend was taking an undergrad class in my U.
Oh, cool. Oh, awesome. Oh, that's
Fun.
It's good.
Reducing.
Do you want to start?
Great. Let us go ahead and get started. So, we turn today to the launch pad of what will be the rest of the class, namely trying to think through some of the great religious and philosophical traditions of the world and learning from them. If that sounds like an insane task for what I think we have 11 weeks left to go, that's actually peanuts. So what I'm going to do today to introduce where we're going is a grand, but nonetheless very brief discussion of the emergence of these major religious and philosophical traditions we've been talking about. We will then turn specifically to the first of the ones that we'll be wrestling with, namely Christianity. And as always, our goal will be to see the most powerful, challenging parts of the tradition that we can build from, while at the same time learning from what at least we will argue might be some of the less powerful ways in which these have been domesticated. And in those cases, the question will be, how do we avoid the dangers these traditions have fallen into? So, to introduce today's session, and really the next 11 weeks, let me begin with some grand generalizations about all of world history, touching on some themes we mentioned very briefly in the first class, and a little bit more so here, but still quite briefly. Nonetheless, an important jumping pad for where we will be going. So, let us jump back about 3,000 years. If you looked at the world of Eurasia 3,000 years ago, looking here mainly at the big agricultural areas on the eastern and western sides of Eurasia and the southern side, so leaving out the pastoral nomadic peoples in Central Asia, just for the exercise that will become obvious momentarily, what you would see is actually a surprising degree of similarity. All of these civilizations were organized in very comparable ways with very comparable religious systems. We have in retrospect named these Bronze Age civilizations simply because the major metal used at the time was bronze. Bronze is an alloy of tin and copper, and it is very expensive to make, relevant because bronze was controlled by a tiny aristocratic elite. And this was telling about the nature of these civilizations. The huge Bronze Age Eurasian civilizations, lasting through the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE, were completely hierarchical societies in which pretty much all positions of power were defined exclusively on birth, controlled at the top, of course, by a very powerful and very small aristocracy, and positions were ranked all the way down. And the religious systems were part and parcel of that same social structure. The general view, again, generalization that holds for all of these civilizations, is that above there are tons of different divinities. We can name these gods, spirits, ghosts, ancestors. There are different ways of mapping them. However, there are a plethora of divinities. They tend to be extremely capricious, and humans try to forge connections with them through things like ritual and sacrifice, which, when successful, will hopefully gain their support and bring down benefits to the living. However, those who can do this, in other words, give the rituals and sacrifices to these divinities, is limited to a very small priestly class. Indeed, that often was also an hereditary position. So, one hereditary position, or the priests, they would give offerings to these divinities. They would act on behalf of the royal class, which was the most powerful by far aristocratic family. And because the aristocratic family, would support the priests and vice versa, it would, when it worked, hopefully gain support for the ruling family by the divine powers. The rest of the hierarchy goes all the way down to peasantry working the fields, and there was virtually no chance of any social mobility whatsoever. The most you could hope for largely was to do well within your pre-given social grouping. To give a famous example from the Western tradition, if you say, look at the Iliad, you have a king, Agamemnon, who is the king. You have a warrior, Achilles. And you have, of course, a host of gods above that are constantly being sacrificed to gain their support, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. All that Achilles can hope for is to wrestle in this world of these divine powers and the war with the Trojans to gain fame. Kleos, if he can be successful, obviously he was, then there will be presumably epics written about him, which in this case is why we know about him. But he will never become a king, obviously. And so he is a warrior, there are kings, there are priests, and there they will remain. And of course, we hear nothing in the Iliad about the peasants. We do hear about people on the sides of Achilles' chariot handing him spears, but this is the social hierarchy of the day. These Bronze Age societies were in existence for 2 to 3 millennia. However, they fall apart across the board over the course of the first millennium BCE. We know these societies in retrospect by the name Iron Age societies, for the reason that will become obvious by now. The main metal used is iron, but here again, it's a telling designation. Iron, unlike bronze, is not expensive. Iron exists everywhere. It is a natural substance. The technological leap required to work with iron is it requires a huge amount of heat, but once you figure out how to create that amount of heat and work with iron, you can mass produce iron at incredible levels. The result is, unlike bronze, which is controlled by a very tiny aristocracy, iron, on the contrary, becomes a widespread metal, meaning that peasants in the fields can use iron implements, leading to a dramatic increase in population. You can mass produce iron weapons, meaning you have mass infantry armies as opposed to, going back to our example, Achilles on his Bronze Age chariot. Warfare was controlled by an aristocracy, the warrior class. In the Iron Age, these become mass infantry armies. And because of both of these, as you can imagine, radical population growth, the emergence of huge mass infantry armies, you begin to have, for the first time in about 3 millennia, the openings of possibilities of social mobility and the slow breakdown of these old Bronze Age kingdoms. I mention all of this for now the crucial thing. While they begin to break down, you see the emergence across Eurasia of a series of radical movements. We can term these radical religious movements, radical philosophical movements, but in both cases, we have to expand our definition of the term and take out any distinction between them. Attempts to radically rethink the world, radically rethink social formations, all asking, in the midst of the breakdown of these old Bronze Age kingdoms, what do we do? At this time, and these are rough contemporaries, you see the emergence of figures like, on the western end of Eurasia, the pre-Socratics, Plato, Aristotle. You see the emergence in South Asia, the Upanishads, the Buddha. In East Asia, you have the emergence of figures like Confucius, Lao Tzu, Mencius, all relative contemporaries within about a century or two of each other, all calling for a radical rethinking of the world. These movements, which were later in the 20th century put under a rubric of axial age movements, meaning an axis of world history, are the beginnings of what will become the major philosophical and religious traditions of Eurasia. Now, what are some of the generalizations? The first and most important is a rejection of everything we have been discussing, both in terms of what is above and in terms of social formations. In terms of what is above, lots of different possibilities, but let me just mention a couple to make the general point. In Greece, giving Plato as the obvious example, one that will play and exercise a huge role in later Western religions and philosophy, you will get the argument that there is a world of forms, ideas above. The world of us is a world of impermanence. A true practitioner, what he will call a philosopher, is one who can achieve the world of forms, leaving behind this mundane world that we mistakenly see as being actually significant. Before I discuss why that is going to be so important in world history, let me just give another example. In that example, there's a world of absolute being above the world that we know. Another way of doing it, it will become very important in South Asia, as we will see, is to argue that actually everything, unlike the way we mistakenly experience it, is in fact one. And the world we experience of different things is because of our inability to see this deeper oneness of everything. And despite the radical differences between these two, both have the key following implication. The entire world of these previous Bronze Age religions was epiphenomenal and based upon these lesser understandings. Who are these individuated divinities? Well, it varies by the movement, but either they don't exist, or they exist, but the last thing you want to be doing is giving them sacrifices. Your goal should be reaching up to something deeper, more powerful, more primordial. Being above, or the more primordial one. And, at least as importantly, and arguably more so, access to this deeper, more powerful, more important, more primordial being, be it a being above or a more primordial oneness of the world, is open to anyone through spiritual practice. It is not restricted to those who are born into a priestly class who can then give sacrifices to a series of divinities. Anyone undergoing the proper philosophical training, or religious training, again, these are straining our definitions of the terms, would be able to gain access to this. Now, I might add just very briefly one other variation that we'll be getting to in a few weeks. We'll say, this is going to be important in Confucianism, instead of positing a more primordial reality, the argument will be, no, the world is just a mess of endless interactions, and therefore, you stop worrying about trying to sacrifice to these divine figures, and you do follow ritual, but you follow ritual to create and construct a better world for humans and a better world of human relationships. But there too, the key is anyone properly being trained to do so can gain access to the most important thing, which in this case is not access to a more primordial truth. It is an ability to become a sage and build better worlds. For all of their seeming radical differences, and we'll see there are indeed radical and significant differences amongst these, here let me point out the tremendous similarity. All are rejecting the entire religious basis of the Bronze Age religions, and all are claiming not immediate open access to everyone, but potential open access to anyone who undergoes the proper spiritual training. Now, all of these religions end up being taken up in various ways, and not surprisingly domesticated, by the ensuing emergence of these huge Iron Age empires that a couple of centuries later will end up taking over most of the agricultural civilizations of Eurasia. The Roman Empire, the Mauryan Empire, and the Han Empire. That, in turn, will lead to yet another radical moment, where the more radical strains of what are called these axial age movements will again reemerge in the form of radical salvationist movements. These will occur mainly in the 1st, 2nd centuries of the Common Era and continue through the 8th century of the Common Era. Many of these are ones we know very well as well. Christianity, of course, later Islam. When we turn to South Asia and moving into Central Asia, the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism, as we will see a new form of Buddhism. And if you turn to East Asia, this is when you get these tremendous salvationist Taoist movements. Also, radical attempts to sort of bring back the most radical sides of the axial age movements that were seen as having been domesticated by the empires. Early on, many of these were anti-imperial, Christianity being an obvious example. And, surprise, surprise, welcome to world history, many of these in turn became domesticated. Christianity, of course, ends up becoming the imperial religion of the Roman Empire, of all things, and comparable things play out with the Mauryan empires and the post-Han empires in China, and the entire process in that sense continues. I say in that sense because to a certain extent, this period of incredibly radical religious movements emerging to break apart the world or calling for a breaking apart of the world ceases. So you have this extraordinary period of roughly a millennium, something like 6th, 5th century BCE, through about the 8th century, when you have this extraordinary emergence and re-emergence of these movements, and then they largely become closed off. So our concern among many in this class is going to be to ask what was going on, what can we learn from these movements, why did they, in a sense, stop, and how do we learn from them to rethink the world and build upon the most powerful elements we can find in them while seeing the dangerous ways that they were, in each different way, domesticated. So, with that as a grand, general, absurdly quick world history, let me now turn to the specific example for today, which is Christianity. And here we've already seen a bit of it, so I'll be a little bit briefer in the beginning parts of this. So, needless to say, Christianity is one of these major salvationist religions that emerges in the 1st century of the Common Era. It is, as all of these salvationist religions are, a mixing of very different elements, for better and for worse, as we will see. It, on the one hand, will build upon the monotheistic traditions emerging out of the Near East, combining those with the visions of being developed in Greek philosophy, resulting in this vision of a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, and infinite, who created this world within which we exist, and that God, both monotheistic, but also a part and parcel of a Greek vision of pure being, becomes a key part of the legacy. It certainly early on is an anti-imperial force, calling for access for anyone to salvation, an absolute rejection of earlier hierarchies, and the hierarchies that we know would play later into the religion, and it becomes one of the dominant religions in world history. Now, I'm going to jump about a millennium, a little bit more, to move us very quickly to ourselves, or rather of ourselves in the past few centuries. So, once this emerges, once it becomes domesticated in the Roman Empire, it is re-domesticated again during the Middle Ages, it becomes part and parcel of a feudal religion that in many ways replicates the earlier Bronze Age religions. In Europe, of course, in the Middle Ages, all social powers again ranked by birth, you're born into a class and there you remain, and so it becomes just another re-domesticated version of what we saw in the Bronze Age. However, its potentially revolutionary power begins to play out again in the early modern period, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and progressively so. Now, in terms of how this plays out, there is both much to learn and much to be concerned about. And for the purposes of our class, let me just mention a few of the ways that versions of Christianity in a secularized form play a role in the development of Western societies over these key centuries. One of these we saw last week, we mentioned it in brief last week, which is the idea that building upon one piece of the Christian tradition, namely the Protestant tradition, or one piece of the Protestant tradition, the privatized version of the Protestant tradition, in which you got to focus on the individual true self, trying to gain access without any mediation to God. And in the secular version of that, as we saw, you start getting the notion in the 17th and 18th centuries of each individual should be thought of as a sovereign, but a sovereign in a pretty minimal sense, which is a sovereign individual with power over his, exclusively his at this stage, property. And then these sovereign individuals with their own property can form a social contract by which they decide what are the conditions under which they will give up some of their property and some of their autonomy in order to deal with other human beings, leading to these visions of altruism that we were discussing, where in various forms you get attempts to have these sovereign individuals being able to get along with each other. So this, of course, is the version that we know as liberalism. Another version that we will be discussing a little bit more in a few weeks, but let me mention it very briefly, here is a version that will take the general visions of history from Christianity and secularize those by saying it is a human project working toward the completion of all of human history, which would again be accomplished by humans, minus any godly intervention. The most famous examples of these are, for example, Hegel, who in the early 19th century will start developing these extraordinary dialectics in which all of human history is read as a teleology leading to a final moment, and in that final moment, all individual subjectivity becomes perfectly connected to the structures of the world, and he felt he was living in the day when that was occurring, so the Prussian state of the early 19th century was accomplishing this, and that moment was the fulfillment of history in which there was a perfect linking of humanity with the world, a secularized version of Christianity. Other examples of this, of course, include things like Marx, who will see a very comparable teleology, but resulting not in his own day, but rather in a future communist utopia. Perhaps the most ludicrous, but bizarrely still highly influential example is Francis Fukuyama, who in 1989 argues that yes, Hegel was right, except history did not culminate actually in the Prussian state, it culminated in, of all things, American neoliberalism of the 1990s. He literally argues this, and this is the point at which we have finally achieved the final understanding of how humans can properly live in the world. All of these, Hegel, Marx, Fukuyama, and there have been, of course, many, many others, are taking secularized visions of Christianity and saying, we humans can accomplish this. Yet another example would be, and we'll be discussing this too in a few more weeks, is taking the vision of incarnation when God becomes incarnate in a human, in this case Jesus Christ, and saying, your goal is not to think of every individual as a sovereign with his own property. Try to think of every individual as having a purely radical spirit, divine spirit, and then you create this vision where humans, individuals I should say, much more importantly, are constantly trying to break against the structures of the world, which limit us. That is a vision, as we will see, that will become incredibly important in Romanticism. So, with these three, liberalism, grand historical theodicies, teleologies resulting in a perfect order, which is somehow existent in Western European history, either already or soon to come, or in the radical romantic visions, you have three versions of a secularized understanding of Christianity. We are saying all of this because we feel there is much to build on in all of these, and yet much to be very concerned about in all of them as well. So let me sketch out what it is we were trying to do when we gave you these readings, and then use that to introduce you to Professor Unger, who is trying to develop a radical rethinking of the Christian tradition for the future. So here's what we were thinking for these readings. What about two issues that in various ways are either being left out or domesticated in potentially limiting and sometimes even dangerous ways in the various forms of secularization we have just mentioned? We would like to suggest two of these, love and infinity. Love being this radical notion, we touched on it very briefly last week, and we'll be touching on it much more in discussions to come, would be to say, what about that key element of Christianity in which the focus is not a secularized notion of altruism between sovereign individuals with their property, the liberal vision. It is rather a vision of radical love, virtually inconceivable to actually put into practice, and yet that is precisely its power. It is so radically counterintuitive, and therefore, what would it mean to build a social world and to build social relationships based upon love? And number two, what about infinity? This notion that does play a crucial role in the Romantic tradition, but in ways that, as we will see, can be very, very dangerous. What would it mean to play this out in a different way? This vision that in Christianity you would have a notion of infinity that becomes incarnate in a human being, a spirit in a limited body, an infinite above becoming incarnate in a limited structure on earth. And how would we rethink that, not in a romantic vision of an endless rebellion by the romantic poet against society, but rather rethink that together with the notion of love to radically rethink what human agency would mean, what our purpose in life would mean, what relationships would mean, and what a socio-political order would mean. To do this, we find one must look not in most of the dominant ways that Christianity has become institutionalized, but rather in a sense on the fringes. Needless to say, our greatest power is not going to be found in medieval thoughts on the inherent hierarchy of the great chain of being. We are not going to find our most powerful elements in, say, to give the example I just mentioned, Hegel's secularized vision of a dialectic. Rather, what are those moments when you see pieces of this being played out in ways that we could build upon? Sticking with that latest example, we assigned Hegel not in his grand dialectical teleological vision. We've assigned early Hegel, before he developed this, in his early theological writings, where he is trying to develop a notion of radical love based upon the Christian tradition. And it's kind of the road not taken. Not long after writing these works, he then starts developing these grand teleologies for which he becomes so famous. But can we go back to that vision of love and build upon it? What about notions of infinity that play out in different theologians? Sometimes without their full agreement with where we would take it, but are there pieces there that we could build upon to rethink elements of this tradition to bring it to bear? And how would we do so? This takes us to both the last piece that we've assigned, and of course the person I will be turning to momentarily, which is we are blessed to have Professor Roberto Unger, who sees as one of his major projects the work that we have just outlined. So he sees
Michael,
as his
just-
work.
Just one request.
Two sentences.
One
I won't
request.
embarrass you too much.
Don't call me professor.
Okay. I thought you were worried I was going to embarrass you, because I am going to embarrass you, but not too much. So Roberto, so one of his projects is to say exactly this. What if we build on notions of love and infinity, looking at not the ways these ideas have been most predominantly exercised and institutionalized and consolidated in the Christian tradition, but rather in the fringes, the places where, he will argue, Christianity was not overly taken by Greek visions of being, because he thinks that is a loss when that occurred, What about the places? In other words, where do we find places where you're not focused on the notion of being developed in Greece, but other sides of infinity and love that allow us to play this out? You're going to find, the example I just gave are these early theological writings of Hegel. You will also find it in Shakespeare. You will also find it in the Romantics, but again with a critique. What are the dangers of the ways they did it, and how can we learn from that? And one key piece of the religion of the future that you're reading for today is Roberto's working out of the implications of love and infinity for a radically different vision of what a future form of these ideas. It would no longer be purely Christian. I'm not even sure if the word secular would be the word for it either. It would strain our definitions of religious, philosophical, etc. But a religion of the future building upon these pieces there in the tradition, but kind of submerged and or domesticated in different ways. So with that as a quick introduction to where we'll be going for the remainder of today's session, can I turn it over to you?
So I'm going to make remarks not about what I think, but how I interpret Christianity, which is our subject today in today's class. And indeed, as you said, I think that if we attempt to state the doctrines of Christianity, the distinctive and original element in naturalistic language, without supernatural presuppositions, the two central themes are love and infinity. Christianity is the religion of love. Love is the organizing principle of moral experience, and this is related to the idea of the participation of the individual human being in the inner life of God, transcendence, infinity. The relation between these two themes seems to me to be the most perplexing element in the interpretation of Christianity. How should we understand the relation between the supremacy of love as an organizing principle of moral experience and the participation of the individual in the infinite? Now, a step back. In our civilization in the West, almost all of the greatest achievements have a relation to Christianity, a perplexing relation. They are, many of them, unthinkable without Christianity, and yet they don't seem to be representative of Christian orthodoxy. So take, for example, the plays of Shakespeare or the philosophy of Hegel. Are they Christian? It's questionable whether they're Christian. Certainly, Shakespeare seems to have been a Christian or regarded himself as a Christian, and Hegel certainly regarded himself as a devout member of the Reformed Church. But we have reason to think that the relation to Christianity is questionable. And this is a strange thing, that we can't understand any of these achievements without Christianity, and yet maybe they're not Christian. So then, how should we understand what the Christian message is? And here I want to do what a believer would resist doing, which is to separate the rational or naturalistic element in the religion from the supernatural narrative of creation and redemption. And then I want to discuss the connection between the natural and the supernatural. So the first theme is love. Love rather than altruism as the organizing principle of moral experience. And I remind you of the contrast between love and altruism. So first, in altruism, the central problem is the overcoming of selfishness, of self-centeredness. In love, the problem is our reconciliation with one another. In altruism, there is the requirement of sacrifice. A person is an altruist because he sacrifices something for the sake of another. But sacrifice given from a distance and even from on high. In love, there is also always an imaginative threshold. The initial problem in love is the imagination of the other, the otherness of the other, how to imagine it. That's the central problem. And finally, in altruism, although there may be a need to sacrifice, as I said last time, even one's own life, there's no inner jeopardy. In love, the price of love is a heightened acceptance of vulnerability. Love can be rejected, it can be rebuffed, or it can fail. So there's an experience of inner jeopardy, whether or not there is some material sacrifice that is involved. So love is not the same thing as altruism. And the first thing I want to say is that what is distinctively and originally Christian is the idea is that what matters most is love and not altruism. Now, right there we have a problem in the historical development of Christianity, because most of the doctrinal accounts of the Christian message for how to live emphasize agape, charity, and charity seems to be altruism. So, and we see this throughout Western literature also. For example, take Proust's novel. Remember that he describes a world of illusion. The question is it really possible to love? Everything seems to be false and contaminated by vanity. And the model of the superior sentiment in the novel is the disinterested love of the grandmother for the narrator, which seems to be altruism and not love. So, and then we have in the in European romanticism, we have supposedly an account of the supremacy of love. The individual goes in quest of the beloved in order to find himself. And he struggles with society for the sake of love, supposedly. And yet you notice that in the romantic novel, although the object is to win the hand of the beloved, the result is never portrayed. So in the romantic love, the marriage, which comes at the end, is not represented because the marriage is unimaginable for a romantic. Love is the real object, not what is supposed to be its result, which are the feared routines of married life, the tomb of love. So there's this ideal of love, but the question is, how is it manifest in the world? What is its practical presence? And the triumph of love over altruism seems to be difficult to establish or even to imagine. Now I come to the second theme. So the second theme is the theme of infinity. Once again, in this naturalistic language. Everything in our experience points beyond itself. So we human beings are formed by particular social and conceptual worlds, but there is always more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, the human race, than there is or ever can be in them. So the idea is that we spill over, we overflow, we exceed, we transgress, we negate. And this quality of there being more in us than there is in them, the context, the structures, the regimes are always finite in relation to us, and we are infinite in relation to them. That's this idea of transcendence. And this primacy of infinity, of transcendence in human experience is manifest in every department of our experience. So, for example, cognitively, in the imagination portrays a phenomenon from a distance and then subsumes it under a range of variations. That's how we understand anything. We understand anything by negating it, by seeing it as a variation of a series of other possibilities. And it's manifest in the life of desire, because it seems that we always desire the infinite. We're surrounded only by finite things, and we make these finite things serve as the untenable proxies for what we really want, which is something unconditional. An assurance that there is a place for each of us in the world, and we make these finite things serve as the inadequate substitutes for what we really desire, which is always the horizon beyond. So that's us. That's what I'm saying is the infinite. And that's the practical substance of this idea that in our experience, in our existence, everything points beyond itself to this horizon. Now, just as the experience of love contrasts with altruism, and most accounts in the development of Christian moral doctrine about how to live seem to emphasize altruism and not love. So, with respect to this relation between the spirit and the world, the human world, we're told, Christ taught, we should be in the world without being of it. In becoming insiders in some way and engaging, we must remain outsiders. But this doctrine that to be embodied spirit, we must participate and resist at the same time, seems to be constantly denied on two sides. And now I'm going to call these two sides of denial heresies, and I'm going to use the habit of patristic theology, the early theology of the Christian church, of giving names to these heresies, the names of individuals. So one I'm going to call the Hegelian heresy. And the Hegelian heresy is that there is ultimately a resting place for the spirit. That is, we begin in a situation in which our spiritual life is totally at one with the practical arrangements of society. So our subjectivity is denied, it's repressed, we identify with the social world. Then we pass through a long period of estrangement, as Hegel describes it in the Phenomenology of Mind, in which we develop forms of subjectivity that are in contradiction with the practical arrangements of social life. And these contradictions drive forward our spiritual progress in history. And finally, at the end, we reach a point at which we establish a set of arrangements in which at last we can be at home. They are the resting place. They are the home of the human spirit. Now, this is a heresy, I want to say, for a Christian. A Christian has to think, if my naturalistic account is correct, that he can never have a home in the world, that some arrangements of society are better than others, but no arrangement is the definitive home of the spirit. And to think otherwise is heretical. So that's the Hegelian heresy. And the Hegelian heresy has been practiced in the development of the church in this sense that we see that Christianity has had a series of transactions, of settlements with regimes of social life. So, for example, the feudal ethic of chivalry is a kind of compromise between the practical hierarchical structures of medieval European society and the Christian vision. The Victorian ethic of family respectability is another such compromise. One compromise after another, all of them are or should be unacceptable to a Christian. A Christian has to believe that all institutional arrangements are dust in the eyes of God. All of them must be overturned and ultimately broken through, because they are not and cannot be the infinite, or the home for this infinite spirit who participates in the inner life of God. Now, the opposing heresy, let me call it the Sartrean heresy. And it goes through 3 moments in its development. First, the moment of the negative theology of the mystics, the mystical countercurrents within Christianity, as within the other Semitic monotheisms, Judaism and Islam, then 19th century European Romanticism, and then existentialism. And the idea is that we are fully human, we are fully ourselves, only in those interludes in which we shake the structures. So, romantic love, by contrast to the routines of married life. The mob in the streets in the revolutionary moment, as opposed to the bureaucratic routinization of the state and so forth. But, the Romantic says, ultimately these structures will reassert themselves. The shaking of the structures is momentary. That's when we're really or fully alive, but is destined to be ephemeral. That's the Romantic idea. So the Romantic idea is a kind of despair about our power definitively to change the relation between structure and spirit. We can shake the structures or the routines, but we can't fundamentally change the opposition between structure and spirit. We can't create structures that are more hospitable to the spirit because, for example, they invite their own revision and they allow us to participate in them while we continue to resist them. That's what I'm calling the Sartrean heresy. So if we now examine the history of Christian teaching about society, not now about the conduct of life, what we seem to find is a history of heresy, because almost the totality of the doctrines of the church about the organization of society are versions of these heresies that I've described. It's as if the orthodoxy, the third position, is always beyond the horizon, is always a thing which has not been stated. Now let me give you an example of this problem. A practical example. So the efforts of the church, the Catholic Church, to develop its social teaching, its teaching about the organization of society, especially through the vehicle of the papal encyclicals, the encyclicals of the popes. So at the end of the 19th century, the seminal encyclical was Rerum Novarum in 1891, Pope Leo XIII. And there is a teaching of the social rights of everyone, to their dignity, to their promotion, and so forth. There's no institutional machinery. So it's a promise of rights without institutional machinery. That's just like the constitutions of the 20th century, from the Weimar Republic on. They're full of promises of rights. They promise the sky to everyone, but they don't tell us how we're to get it, by what form of organization of society. Then, 40 years later, in the period between the wars, the church took a risk, and it developed a concrete institutional doctrine. It is stated in the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, Pope Pius XI. And we would describe it today as a corporatist communitarianism. So the main message there is that class conflict should be contained, and there should be cooperation between capitalists and workers. There should be guilds, there should be corporate organizations that bring the workers and the capitalists together against socialism and also against liberal capitalism. And that was the doctrine of corporatist communitarianism, the suppression of conflict for the sake of cooperation and the restabilization of the economic order. It was, in fact, to the embarrassment of the church, it was very close in its institutional form to the doctrines of the fascist state. And it was an embarrassment. And it was an embarrassment that the church abandoned then. Having attempted to form an institutional doctrine, the institutional doctrine was soon discredited in its own eyes. And then the papal encyclicals at the end of the 20th century returned to the position that they had at the end of the 19th century. If you look at them today, they're once again full of promises of rights with no institutional machinery. So the attempt to propose how society should be organized was then abandoned. There was an attempt, and the attempt didn't work. And now we came back to the point of departure. So this shows the difficulty of escaping from the interaction between the dialectic between the Hegelian and the Sartrean heresy. So the doctrine of love and the idea of infinity. What does the idea of infinity require for society? Not define. And how can love, in fact, achieve primacy over altruism as the organizing principle of the moral life? Also uncertain. Now then we come to what I said a moment ago was the great enigma in the interpretation, in this naturalistic interpretation of Christianity, which is, what's the relation between the centrality of love and this idea of the infinite? One way of describing the relation is to say, in love, in the experience of love, we are able to recognize one another as the context-transcending, role-transcending originals that we all know ourselves to be. Participants in divinity, in the inner life of God. But, and here's the problem, we clearly are not yet these individuals. We have to make ourselves into them through history. And so this is a project. It's not just a description. And the question is, what is the content of this project? As a way of life and as a way of organizing society. And that's undeveloped. So on this account, it is perplexing in the history of Christianity that the Orthodox message is not really developed, because the history of Christian moral and political doctrine is, to a large extent, if I am correct, a history of heresy. Now, of course, for the believer, and I've not been speaking as a believer, the content of these ideas is inseparable from the narrative of creation and redemption. God intervenes in history to save the world. And through the incarnation of Christ, the redemption of humanity. And we have to ask, what is the relation of these themes, which I've just described in secular language, to this narrative of creation and redemption? So Adolf Harnack, I think one of the most characteristic Protestant theologians of the 19th century, thought that the central tenet in Christianity was the idea of eternal life. And we could expand that conception somewhat to say, the idea is that we participate in the divine life, and not by sharing in the divine attributes of omnipotence and omniscience, but by increasing our share in the divine attribute of transcendence. And if we participate in the inner life of God, somehow this participation must involve a promise of eternal life. This is a flame, the flame of life, which cannot be quenched in some form which we are unable to understand. We participate in it. And that seems to be the basic form of the connection. And then we are given this narrative of God's intervention in the world to create, first to create the world, and then to save it through the incarnation of Christ. Now, it is difficult to believe this narrative. It is difficult for an unbeliever to believe it, and it is easy to fall out of belief having believed it. And because the narrative seems to impose on us what we could call the scandals of reason. So let's go through these scandals one by one and understand why faith is difficult. So first there's the scandal of supernaturalism. God's intervention in the world imposes the suspension of the normal causal connections. And right there's a problem, because if some of the causal connections are suspended, what happens to the rest that aren't suspended? It's a classic problem in counterfactual argument. If you suspend part of the connections, do the others remain in place? Everything seems to be, as it were, up for grabs. It doesn't seem possible to contain the consequences of this partial suspension of causality in some simple way. And the suspension of causality is in every part of the Christian doctrines, not just in the central mysteries of the Trinity and incarnation, but for example, in the virginal birth of Christ. All of this presupposes a suspension of normal, natural causality. Then the second scandal of reason is the way in which, in Christianity, as also in Judaism and Islam, the two other Semitic monotheisms, the universal message, the message of the primacy of love and of our participation in the infinite, has to be born, sustained, by a particular plot. And so there's this paradoxical relation between the universality of the message and the particularity of the plot. Why was Christ born as a Jewish zealot in a provincial province of the Roman Empire, rather than somewhere else at some other time? Why in the reign of the Emperor Augustus, rather than earlier so that more people could have been saved, or later when the message would have been subject to less misrepresentation? Why these particular protagonists of this universal message? Why not a world of protagonists? An unanswerable question. Now, the third scandal of reason is perhaps the most fundamental. It's the scandal of the incomprehensibility of the idea of God. So there are three conceptions of God that we could have, and it seems that none of them can do the job. So the first is, God is a person, as we have an anthropomorphic idea of God as the counterpart to a theomorphic vision of the human person, this person who affirms the primacy of love and shares in the infinite. But this anthropomorphic idea of God seems to be inadequate to serve the function, because what is God? Is God like a big person, like he's a Gulliver in relation to the Lilliputians, or is it a fundamental transformation in nature? On the other hand, God could be a being, impersonal. But the impersonal God, the being, then, the God of the philosophers, the God of Spinoza, seems not capable of serving the functions of playing the role that the religion demands. Heidegger, in the 20th century, said, if one day I wrote a theology, the word being would not occur in it, because it can't be impersonal. One of the characteristics of Christianity is that it affirms the primacy of the personal over the impersonal. The idea of the philosophers was the personal is contingent, is accidental. Philosophy is about the impersonal. That's heretical. So then we come to the third idea of God, which is the idea of the mystics, the via negativa, which is, how do we understand God? God is non-person and non-being. It is simply a statement of negation. And that seems to be without content. So it's like a declaration of our inability to comprehend. So, you know, there's the famous ontological argument from the Middle Ages that we prove the existence of God by affirming that his existence is part of his perfection. And because the idea is an idea of the perfect being, it must imply its existence. This is a kind of inversion of the ontological argument that I'm suggesting. How can a being exist that is incomprehensible? But this is one of the scandals of reason. Now, we could add a fourth scandal, but of a completely different character from these three scandals, which is that despite the phenomenon of conversion from one religion to another, the vast majority of people who belong to one of these religions, and the vast majority of Christians, are Christians because their parents were. And this is something that we have trouble admitting, recognizing. What is the status of a belief that depends on the accident of birth and parental influence? So these are the scandals of reason. Now, the cumulative effect of the scandals of reason is to make belief difficult. So we would like to believe, as William James said, people believe everything they can, and we can't believe. Now, the effect of the combination of Christian orthodoxy with the scandals of reason and the difficulty of belief is the dilution of the religion, the common dilution of the religion, and its transformation, its degradation into a set of metaphors or allegories in which we don't fully believe, we half believe. And the place of faith is usurped by the sentimental will to believe. We want to believe, or many want to believe, and therefore caught in this halfway house between belief and unbelief. And the halfway house is a dangerous position. First, because it implies self-deception. But second, because if we examine retrospectively what results from the religion that emerges from this halfway house between belief and unbelief, it tends to be a dressed-up version of the moral and political pieties of the day. So then we don't need religion. We don't need that kind of religion. Religion is supposed to be like a storm that takes us in a direction that we didn't want to go or didn't imagine. Not just a way of restating what we believed anyway in the categories of some supernatural narrative of creation and redemption. So this is why it's problematic and difficult for us. And yet, the religion continues to have this untapped explosive power even today, and continues to occupy this dominant position in our civilization. I want to ask a final question about the relation of Christianity to philosophy. Because I claim, that the history of Christian teaching about the conduct of life and the organization of society seems to be in large part a history of heresies. And the orthodoxy is missing, is not stated or not developed in the history of the religion. And I think one reason for this that should interest us, given the nature of our inquiries here in the course, is the surprising, improbable, unacceptable marriage of Christian faith to Greek philosophy. So the founts of Christian orthodoxy attempted to restate the ideas of Christianity in the language of the Greek philosophy of being, in the language of Aristotle and his successors. And then in the development of modern European philosophy, the primacy of what we called early on the philosophy of deep structure, one of the two major traditions in the world history of philosophy, was combined with a characteristic of modern Western philosophy, which is the role of these dualisms. So between nature and grace, between the noumenal and the phenomenal in Kant's philosophy, between the mental and the physical in Descartes' philosophy, and now between the historical world, the human historical world, and the natural world. And these dualisms also seem to be anti-Christian. In the Hebrew Bible, God says, I will pour out my spirit onto all flesh. It's for the whole world. And so then we have the question, so what philosophical position would be adequate to the statement of Christianity? What are the elementary philosophical presuppositions of this missing Christian orthodoxy? And I now want to suggest what some of their elements would be. It's not a philosophical system, but it's like a philosophical minimum. So first, there is one real world, and not a multiplicity of worlds. There's one world, the world that God created, in which God intervenes, in which there's a fateful plot of redemption or damnation. There's one world, and there's not an allegory of possible worlds of which we just happen to be one. Second, in this one world, in this one real world, time is real. God intervenes in time. Our time is a faithful time. Time is not an illusion, and time embraces the whole world. Everything. Everything changes. Third, the new is possible because the creative intervention of God in the world and the vocation of human beings to transcend requires the possibility of novelty, the creation of the new. And Christianity itself proposes to be the most significant representative of the new. Third, history is open. History does not have a closed script. We can intervene in history. God can intervene in history to create the new. Fifth, all the divisions within humanity are shallow and superficial. And we are ultimately united. We are ultimately the same. And sixth, the ordinary, the profane, has more promise than the noble. So the ordinary experience of the ordinary human being is what has promise, not the high-flown ideals and practices of the canonical culture. The vulgar is what has promise, not the noble. So those are the elements. Now, in what tradition of philosophy would these views have a home? It wouldn't be in the philosophy of deep structure. It wouldn't be in the idea of the timeless one. It has to be in that third position that I described, and then I label provisionally temporal naturalism. But that's not a developed position in philosophy, and it's not the basis of traditional Christian theology. So the message of this revolutionary religion is not adequately stated for all these reasons. So why don't we open it? Yes.
You talked a lot about transcendence, and I think you said at some point that everything humans do is pointing towards transcendence. I wonder if you could tell me what transcendence is, what it means to point to it, and what it means to say that everything we do is pointing towards it. Like
So I
how
gave,
singing a song.
yes, so I gave some examples, right, of our mental experience and our desires. So the mind, so let me develop a little bit these two examples. So the mind first. So the human mind has two sides. It has a side in which it's modular and formulaic. It's like a machine. And different parts of the mind and of the underlying physical structure of the brain perform particular functions. But in other respects, the mind is not like a machine. It's an anti-machine. It's not modular and not formulaic. It has the power which we call in mathematics recursive infinity. It can combine everything with everything else. It has another power, which we could call negative capability, the words of the poet, which is it can discover something that don't make sense in the light of its established methods and presuppositions. And then retrospectively formulate the methods and presuppositions that make sense of what it has discovered. That's the imagination. So the imagination denies that a phenomenon is necessary, and it understands it by subsuming it under a range of transformative variations. That's how we understand anything, by negation. So we always understand by jumping ahead, by subsuming the existence under a broader range of possibles. That's one of the core sources of this experience of transcendence, where we don't, if we just look at something and we try and rationalize it, we stare at it, we don't understand it. We understand it by denying its necessity and subsuming it under this range of proximate possibles. Now, our desires are mimetic. We desire what others desire. Human desire is relatively empty, unlike the scripted desires of the other animals, right? It has this roving, undefined quality. And it is also projected. So we desire something that we make stand in the place of something else. So the proximate object of desire may be almost accidental. We desire it for the sake of someone else. So a basic problem in the development of society is Why do we accumulate things? We accumulate things so as not to depend on people, to diminish our dependence on people. So our materialistic accumulation is a substitute for the human solidarity, for the human connection, which we can't have. That's the nature of design. Something is made to stand in the place of something else. Huh? So, again, it's like, it's not this thing, so we're surrounded only by finite things. But what we really desire is something that's infinite, which we can't have. Huh? So the claim that I'm making is that in every department of our experience, the same basic pattern is repeated. And I'm saying that's a Christian idea. And that's why, one of the reasons why Christianity is so powerful in the development of our civilization. Yes?
So transcendence is the desire for the infinite, or like, so we can't ever access transcendence?
Transcendence is the inability to recognize the finite things that we have, the finite institutional arrangements, the finite objects of desire, the finite targets of the imagination as sufficient. So the slogan of transcendence is, the world is not enough. The things that the world gives to us are not enough. We desire the more. And the more that we desire is what I'm calling the infinite. Now, so the infinite appears to us as a horizon, as a negation. It's not something that we can label or describe and find, and we can't have a home in it. And there's this dialectic between participation in the world and negation. So we can go back to this idea of freedom. To be free, I have to participate in a world, but at the same time I have to be able to participate without surrendering to it. I have to be able to continue resisting it. To be free, I have to connect, but I can't allow the connection to subjugate me. I have to have a coherent form of being, but I have to be able to disrupt that form of being. Otherwise, it will become a mummy, a kind of shell around me, and in that shell I will begin to die. So this seems to be a fundamental rhythm of our experience in this naturalistic account. Now, the Christian would say that naturalistic account makes sense when it is enveloped in this larger narrative of creation and of redemption. It doesn't make sense all by itself. So the common critique of Christianity by the contemporary secular thinkers is they say, this search for the eternal, for eternal life, for the transcendent, is a devaluation of the life that we have. We're being estranged from it. I think that for the believer, that's not true. The believer does not experience it that way. So what the believer thinks in the light of the doctrine of analogy is that the Christian message is presenting our relation to one another as analogical to our relation to God. And the whole world of our moral and social experience is then enveloped in a larger dimension, which doesn't deny its value, but gives its value a larger meaning. That's what the Christian believer would say. And I think that from his standpoint, that's correct. That it's not true that this religious faith is necessarily a devaluation of the life that we have. But that, of course, doesn't dispose of the problem of faith, because there's still the question of whether it's true, whether this narrative of redemption is describing the reality of things in the world or not. And that leads us then to the struggle with the scandals of reason. So it's not enough to say, have faith. I want to have faith, but I can't. What am I to do? Huh? And the Christian would say, open yourself. Open yourself to the possibilities of spiritual experience, and God will take you. But will he take me? So this is the question that's left open. Yes.
As I understood you, you were saying that love is distinct from altruism, and that the latter is sacrificial and love is reconciliation.
Well, there are many differences. So you just combined two of the differences, right? But the main claim is that love is different from altruism, and that altruism is the common object. So, and let me make a comment that relates this to our discussion of the school philosophy, which we had last week, right? So, Christ says, love the stranger. And this command seems impossible to implement. We can't love the stranger. And so then come the moral philosophers, and because we can't love the stranger and can't obey Christ's command, the moral philosophers offer us instead the cold comfort of an impersonal and altruistic benevolence. And then we get all these schools of moral philosophy in which the object is altruism, sacrifice, treating the other equally to yourself, and so. Why? Because the other thing, which was commanded by the Redeemer, you can't carry out. So that's then altruism. Yes?
I guess I wonder, within the context of Christianity, how do we make sense then of the sacrificial love of Christ within that sort of theology and cosmology?
Yes. So, yes, so Christ does make the sacrifice, does sacrifice, and then there's this question, are we supposed to imitate his sacrifice? Or does he sacrifice so that we not need to sacrifice? So one interpretation of the sacrifice of Christ is that the sacrifice of Christ was intended to replace the violent sacrificial element in the history of religion, right? That is, God himself became a sacrifice so that humanity would be liberated from the ritual burden of sacrifice. That's one interpretation. As opposed to the idea that we are called to imitate the sacrifice of Christ. Now, we could still sacrifice for others, and our sacrifice be motivated by love rather than by altruism. And that would be, on this view, a higher form. But it's very mysterious. So I think, after all, it's something I want to call your attention to this paradox. We're dealing here with what is in some way the official religion of this great civilization for 2,000 years. And we're having trouble describing what it says. And so this is very strange. It's because it's entered into all of these compromises with Greek philosophy, with the successive regimes in the history of the West, and so many compromises, so many concessions, so much overlap with the world, that in the end, the message itself becomes elusive. Can we recapture what was the message? So that's one, and yet it has this tremendous power. It's like a time bomb, a delayed explosion that still has enormous potential to disturb, to illuminate. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. And with this characteristic that you ask of these, so it's like the question I asked, Are the plays of Shakespeare Christian or unchristian? Now, that's a very hard question to answer. Are they or not? Are they not compatible with the Christian view of the world? There are certainly some poets who we might think of are as genuinely Christian. I would, at the top of the list, we might put Dante Alighieri. But we don't have to go very far down the list to begin to have doubts. For example, John Milton. Was he a Christian? Well, he thought he was. But if you take his account of Satan, you have your doubts. And so this is a source of profound confusion in our civilization for the reasons that I'm trying to understand here. Yes.
I'm unclear on something. So you talked about the commandment in Christianity to love the stranger,
Yes.
love the neighbor, and you've said on numerous occasions it seems to be impossible. So we get some kind of a poor substitute for it in altruism, cold comfort.
There's a better substitute.
Okay, so here's the question. I want to
Yeah.
hear this. Is in this framework then, in this understanding, is altruism then a necessary compromise or degradation of like a higher law?
No, I don't think so. I think that if you now take the broad history of Western societies, what has emerged as the most plausible substitute for love in life among strangers is cooperation. Cooperation among free and equal individuals. So cooperation is the substitute for love among strangers. Now, in cooperation, we can distinguish those forms of cooperation that are based on low trust from forms that are based on higher trust. So, for example, the traditional form of the market economy and its contractual instrument, the bilateral executory promise, the arm's length, fully articulated bargain, and the unified absolute property right, each owner an absolute command in his zone of entitlement. These are the legal instruments of a form of cooperation based on low trust. So then we get, for example, the simple definition of the market. What is a market economy? A market economy is a simplified form of cooperation among strangers that is impossible when there is no trust, but unnecessary when there is high trust. But now we have the emergence of forms of production and economic organization that raise the level of trust. So the knowledge economy requires cooperative competition, the fluid mixture of cooperation and competition, and it heightens the level of discretionary initiative and reciprocal trust required and allowed of participants in the process of production. So it's no longer a simple world of low trust among strangers. It requires an elevation of the level of trust. So to the extent that cooperation involves a heightening of the level of trust, it becomes more like love than it was before. So the relation of the proxy, if we take cooperation as a substitute for love in relations among strangers, it can be more or less like love depending on differences such as this one.
So there are different levels of the
There are different levels.
domestication of love.
There are different
perhaps.
levels. That is, we can say, we can't follow the command of the Redeemer directly, but we can approach it through this reorganization of forms of social life. And then we would have a better solution than the solution of quadragesimo anno, not corporatist communitarianism, but we would say, and for example, on this question of how can I participate in a social world without surrendering to it? So we could say, we need arrangements, economic arrangements, and above all, political arrangements that organize democratic politics in such a way that they diminish the dependence of change on crisis. So in the existing low energy forms of democracy, the rule is no trauma, no transformation. There needs to be a war or an economic collapse for there to be profound change, because they're organized as perpetual motion machines to keep going unless there's an exogenous shock. We could organize them so that the dependence of change on crisis becomes looser. And the impulse to transformation is rendered endogenous. In political life, for example, by raising the temperature, the level of organized popular participation in political life, by accelerating the pace, that is, having constitutional mechanisms for the rapid resolution of impasse, and by promoting the combination of decisive central action with radical devolution. So as I said in an earlier class, society goes down a certain road, it allows parts of itself to secede from the dominant solutions and to create countermodels of the national future. So then it's experimentalism. Now, is that not closer to the Christian orthodoxy as I've characterized it? I said it is. It's not that it is, it's not the Hegelian heresy of the idea, this is the final home of the human spirit, but it's saying, given that all institutions are flawed, if some of them are less flawed than others, how can we diminish this contradiction between spirit and structure? Rather than just taking refuge in the romantic heresy that we can only have that moment of authenticity when the rule of the structures is shaken. Yes?
In that vein, could you say more about, in the reading you talked about courage and forbearance? Because I think a lot of people in the face of these problems that you both have so clearly outlined sort of fall back into quietism, domestication. Could you say more about courage and this kind of ethic that one would need in order to break the
Well, it's complicated. I mean, because it's outside of any particular context. But let me just focus on courage. So, what are these virtues, right? The virtues are habitual dispositions to action. Now, courage is a very interesting virtue, because courage is certainly not one of the highest virtues, but courage is the enabling virtue. In the following sense, that without courage, all the other virtues are rendered sterile. So courage is a virtue that allows the other virtues to be fertile. So courage is the first virtue of the agent in the world to confront the existing world, and of the thinker. The thinker has to be courageous, otherwise his thought comes to nothing. So this is the sense in which courage is the enabling virtue. And it's related to another contradiction that is, I think, very close to the message of Christianity. The slogan of pagan philosophy was "stay out of trouble," right? So the object was serenity. So the object of this pagan philosophy was cast a spell on yourself. You're on the way to death. You will be dissolved. You will be annihilated in the world. In the meantime, compose yourself. And the Christian message is exchange serenity for searching. And searching requires courage. And why? Well, so what is the value? The ultimate value that justifies this substitution of serenity by searching is vitality, is life. So eternal life is the most extreme form, but life comes before rightness and wrongness, before goodness and badness. Life first is the object of faith. And that's why you're exchanging serenity for searching. So this is a profound change in the moral direction of humanity. Yes.
Because I think it's incredibly compelling what you outlined. I think a lot of people almost the bargain they make is they make the decision for life in the direction of conservative, whatever, domestication, quietism, because they see the incredible power and potential of what you're saying, and they see its release, and instead of looking to vitality, they say this is all too decentering. It throws established power norms and institutions into chaos, and instead they say, I'm going to focus on whatever little slice of life I can secure for myself within
Yes.
this bubble. So how do you? I think you spoke to it in the past of not assuming a radical break all at once, but how do you distinguish between the radicalism you're calling for and the kind of gentle vitality that's required?
But let's not think of it just in this heroic vocabulary, right? Of all or nothing, and the total negation of the world or surrender to the world. So there's this phenomenon in human life. As you grow older, there begins a combination of the rigidification of character, which is the reified, the stultified form of the self. You develop a coherent way of being, and that's then combined with your resignation to a certain situation in the world. And at a certain point you begin to think, well, I could have had many lives, but this is the only life that I'm going to live, in fact. So then the combination of the reified self with the situation to which you resign becomes this carapace, this mummy. And within that mummy, you begin to die. So then the idea that emerges from this reading of Christianity is don't die. You should die. Don't die that way. Don't die by installments, right? Don't die little by little. Die only once. Which is the secular version of the doctrine of eternal life. So, but to die only once, then you have this mummy that's forming around you. You have to break out of the mummy, and why you have to, and that requires courage in some sense. Now, why do you have to break out of the mummy? To live. So the slogan of the Christian is, you become. It's not that you become more vital in order to become more godlike. You become more godlike in order to become more vital, to live. That's the purpose. And you have to break out of the mummy. Now, what is the role of the will in this process? Because you can't just will transformation. The role of the will is to project yourself into circumstances into which you will become more vulnerable and have a better chance of disrupting this mummy. So that's then another interpretation of this Christian idea in secular language, in which the will has a powerful but oblique influence on the experience of the individual.
Yes, please.
I wanted to ask about part of what you characterized as the philosophical position necessary to return the orthodoxy of Christianity.
Yes.
One of them you said was that the ordinary.
I'm having trouble hearing loud,
That
please.
the ordinary or the profane.
Has more promise than the noble, yes.
What do you mean by that?
So it's the idea that you could use the Nietzschean slogan of the transvaluation of values, right? That there's this idea that that there are a set of high-flown, refined standards of taste, of value, typically associated with elites in the hierarchical structure of society, as opposed to the experience of the everyday experience of the ordinary individual, profane human existence. Christian idea is that this profane, this everyday, this ordinary, has more spiritual potential than the supposedly noble. That it's from that salvation emerges. And this is an idea that we see developed in the whole history of Western literature. The discovery of the possibilities of the potential contained in the life of the ordinary. And this is the, as it were, the theological significance of democracy. So, on this view, the central faith of democracy is faith in the constructive potential of what ordinary men and women can create in their ordinary experience, as opposed to this idea that the higher values of taste, of capability, will bring salvation to humanity. That's a fundamental message of Christianity. And again, I referred to Proust. You could say Joyce, for example, in Ulysses. It's the romance of everyday life. That's where salvation lies. Salvation lies not in the priestly and the elite. Salvation is around you, and that's the Christian message.
Can you talk a little bit more about the unacceptable marriage between Christianity and philosophy, Greek philosophy?
Well, it's kind of obvious, right? I mean, so you have this narrative of intervention of God in history, and this dramatic portrayal of the transactions between God and humanity in all the Semitic monotheisms, in Judaism and Islam, as well as in Christianity. And what is the philosophical language that the theologians found to describe this? It's astonishing. It was the language of Aristotle. Now, it's completely inappropriate. Impersonal being. And this was the Aquinas in Christianity, Maimonides in Judaism, Averroes in Islam. It was the same thing. So the impersonal Greek philosophy of being is then used as the philosophical device by which to expound the doctrines. Well, right there's a fundamental contradiction. And as I said, the contradiction is deepened by the ascendancy in the history of modern Western philosophy of these successive dualisms. The human being is an exception to the general regime of nature. And these dualisms, you could say, are also anti-Christian. So Christianity has not found an adequate philosophical vocabulary on this view. And it's not surprising because, as I said, the two dominant traditions in the global history of philosophy, the Greek philosophy of being, which continues to shape the history of modern philosophy, and the idea of the timeless one, which was dominant in the philosophy of ancient India, both of them are, to begin with, deny the reality of time. That is, and they say that the more real something is, the less time-bound it is. So time for them is unreality or lesser reality. But for a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, time is the medium through which God acts. And so how can there be a philosophy which diminishes or denies the reality of time and that is faithful to the message of these religions? There can't be. That seems to me to be an insuperable contradiction. Right there. Yes.
So you said that there are two central tenets of Christianity that undergird seek reconciliation, and then second is infinity because we spill over so much. We seek transcendence. So to me, as I understand, isn't exactly
I'm
this,
having trouble.
isn't that exactly what Lucifer in Christianity or Iblis in Islam try to do? Seek transcendence by way of love, which is to be at par and reconcile with the all-being God.
Do you follow that? I
Oh,
didn't.
a little bit louder. It's so sorry. It's
Okay,
tough to
so
hear
we
from you.
mentioned that the central tenets of Christianity that undergird the doctrine is love, which is seeking reconciliation, and secondly, that is infinity, the idea of transcendence. Isn't that exactly what Lucifer in Christianity or Iblis in Islam tried to do, and was heavily penalized for it? So I'm just trying
Who
to.
in Christianity?
Lucifer.
Uh-huh.
Yes. So is this what Lucifer was trying to do?
I don't know what Lucifer was trying to do.
Wasn't Lucifer trying to become at par with God
Uh-huh.
because he whatever loved God so much?
Yeah, so I think Milton
Yeah, exactly.
understood what Satan was trying to do. I have less confidence that I understand what his aims were. Will you answer?
Oh, but I was thinking the exact same thing. So yeah, that in a sense is what Milton is getting at. So if you haven't had a chance to read Milton, Milton presents himself, of course, as a Christian, and so by definition, Lucifer is wrong. And yet, when you read Milton, it's very obvious that not only is Lucifer by far the most fascinating character, it's clearly where Milton's sympathies are. And I think this is in part what you're getting at too. That yes, part of thinking through how to understand Christianity from now and looking at what has developed as orthodox positions and what has not, I think we need to allow ourselves the possibility of saying, are there, I'm going to put this in absurdly provocative ways, but just building on your question, are there reasons that figures like Milton, Blake, many of the romantics were pulled toward Lucifer? And I think part of the answer lies in exactly what you're saying, that in the forms of domestication that occur with Christianity, you get a denial of precisely the sorts of things that Roberto was saying, on the contrary, should be brought to the forefront. Yes.
So the courage which the conventional Christian believer seemed to lack, Lucifer had in spades, right?
Exactly.
And he stands up, he resists, and that's what we should all do on this other interpretation of Christianity.
Indeed.
Michael, I think we've arrived at the end, at your time.
We have indeed. So thank you so much for, as always, a tremendously exciting discussion. And continuing with the absurdity of this course, next week we will move to a one-day discussion of the Upanishads and the history of Buddhism, trying to do with that tradition exactly what we have tried to do in one session with Christianity. And we hope that the insanity of this exercise will prove to be exciting and provocative and not just utterly absurd. Thank you so much.
You guys have this. Some of the attractions. And they pair with each other. Okay, makes sense. It's meant to watch. that's like. I mean, yeah. If just like based on the last class, I'm gonna watch. I don't know. I'd say watch the video. You and I, if you want to talk about it, yeah, clear out the slide deck. Yeah. So it was like a big school. Yeah. Yeah, but the Parfit takes so much on track. Yeah. That I think they would agree. In that what it does. Yeah, it's really clear.